Okay. Hi, everyone. Can you hear me? Okay, I saw a couple nods. Okay, good. Welcome, everyone. Good to see you. Good to see your faces here. For those of you that I haven't met, I'm David Trelevin, and this is a monthly Zoom meetup call that we've been doing for probably the last almost like a year now, I think. And this is a chance for us to come together and really dive into topics around trauma-sensitive mindfulness. So I'm grateful to be here with you all, especially inside of this current moment, which I'll say a little bit about. Just a little bit of context if you haven't been here. The community is primarily for practitioners that are offering mindfulness instruction to others. Could be coaches, could be meditation teachers, but it's also for people that are just interested in the topic. So you're all welcome here, but just so you know that a lot of the conversation tends to direct towards what are best practices around offering mindfulness instruction to folks that are struggling with trauma. The call itself is an hour. And if you're able to be on live video, that's awesome. That's great. And if you're not, if you don't want to be this morning or you'd like to leave the camera off, that's also fine. Just want to encourage seeing people's faces because it's great for us to get to see each other. The chat box is open. This is awesome. See folks letting us know where you're here from. It's amazing and humbling to me that there's people here from all over the world. And so I encourage you to please chat where you're here from. I am solo this morning, so I'm not going to be necessarily monitoring. Oh, wow, Ireland. That's awesome. I won't be necessarily monitoring the chat box. So if, just so you know that if you're asking questions into the chat box, I necessarily won't be responding. We're going to do, just so you know, the structure of the call is I will be talking for a little bit about an issue around trauma and mindfulness. I'm going to lead through a practice, trauma-sensitive practice, and then we'll open it up to the community here. So that could be questions that you're in around the topic that I talked about, around trauma-sensitive mindfulness more generally, or it could be comments about how practice and teaching is for you in this particular moment. In this meetup, it's going to be a little bit different. So here's the structure. Instead of leading with a practice, I'm going to actually start with some comments around this particular moment. And as you might have seen in the email, I want to talk about R.A.I.N today, the acronym R.A.I.N. Recognize, allow, investigate, and nurture, at least from Tara Brach's, her use of the acronym. So I want to talk about R.A.I.N and mindfulness, particularly through the lens of trauma. So I'm going to talk about R.A.I.N, but really break it down as I see some of the benefits of R.A.I.N and also some of the places that R.A.I.N can be somewhat problematic around trauma. And then I'm going to lead through a practice. So I thought it'd be easier to have the comments on R.A.I.N up front, lead through a practice, and then we'll open it up to discussion here with all of you. And then there's also going to be optional breakout rooms at the end of the call. So at the top of the hour, you'll have the chance, if you want, completely optional. If you want to stick around and be in breakout rooms of, say, four or five people and stay for extra 10 or 15 minutes to meet a couple people, you're welcome to do that. So please stick around if you're interested in that. Why don't I just, before I launch into my the comments that I wanted to offer, why don't we take just a brief moment for a centering practice. So I invite you to just take a moment as we enter into the call here. Maybe a couple of deeper breaths. A slower inhale. And then a deeper exhale. If the breath feels too activating for you right now, you're welcome to do anything else that will help you support your presence here. You have your eyes open or closed. I just want to give you a chance to check in with yourself as we start this conversation. For those of you that have studied the window of tolerance, could be, where are you in your window? or it could also be, what's your mood right now coming into the call? And then just making room as best as you can for whatever's here right now. Nothing to change. Good. And then in the next few breaths, I'll invite you to shift in order to be here in whatever way works for you for this conversation. Thanks all. So we'll do a longer practice in probably about 10, 13 minutes. So I wanted to say a couple things about this moment and about this topic around R.A.I.N. And I think this is probably the third, maybe the fourth meetup that we've had since the pandemic and COVID-19 really came into prominence here, at least in the US. I'm in the US. I'm originally from Canada, but living on the West Coast. And I just wanted to take a moment to acknowledge the continued adversity and trauma that many communities and many of us are facing, and what it means to be holding people in practice in this moment. Again, wherever, it could be your own practice, holding ourselves, or it could be that you're working one-to-one with people, or that you're in a group. And what does it mean to be asking people to pay close and sustained attention to their experience in a moment of such intense collective adversity? And this is also the first meetup call that we've had since the killing of George Floyd here in the US. And I imagine many of you are aware of the protests that have opened up here, and then internationally, really, for racial justice here. And just want to say something about that briefly, at least how I'm experiencing it and thinking about it. I definitely look at the world through the lens of trauma. That's just most of where my training has come from. And I'm thinking about, as some of you will know my work, a lot of the work, how I've been trained, is to not think about trauma just as an individual tragedy, but to be always making connections with larger social systems and how they impact trauma. So trauma is never happening in a vacuum. And it is an individual tragedy. And then there's always a social context that's right there. And to me, the more that we as mindfulness, I'll say leaders or mindfulness providers, whatever role you're in, the more that we are attuned to the social context, the more that we're doing our work, whatever location we're in, whatever our skin color, our race, our gender, to me, the more powerful we become as being able to offer teachings into a moment that can speak directly to the people that we're working with. Again, whatever location that we're in. So if I'm working with, in this case, I'm someone who's white, if I'm working with someone who's a person of color, to know that in offering mindfulness practice, I'm offering mindfulness inside of this particular moment around racial injustice and what's come to light. So that's a lot of the focus that I've had in my work. I'm happy to talk more about it here. But I just wanted to say something about what I'd say is collective trauma and PTSD, because I've been in the US now for about 12 years, and I had always known that there was a deep wound around the legacy of slavery and colonization here in the US, but there's been something different about actually being here and seeing how the collective communities that I'm in and systems kind of move around race and racism. And the one thing I wanted to draw attention to around what I'd say is collective trauma right now are two elements of post-traumatic stress disorder, two criteria, and that is avoidance and intrusion. So some of you will know the diagnostic criteria for PTSD, but two of the main criteria is that there's some form of avoidance and also intrusion. So for an individual, avoidance could look like I'm avoiding a particular location. So maybe I had a car accident and I avoid the place where I had that accident. It can also be that there's avoidance of internal stimuli. So it could be that I have this intense gripping in my stomach, and my avoidance behavior is to just really dissociate from the body or not feel that discomfort in the stomach or those sensations. So avoidance is one, and then intrusion is another, where it could be, intrusive thoughts, nightmares, intrusive sensations. There's an intrusion that is often very dysregulating for trauma survivors. And the reason I wanted to bring that up is, as we look collectively at this moment around the protests against racial injustice, to me, the relationship that I'd say the state of the US and so many communities have towards racism is one of collective trauma. It is one of avoidance and intrusion, because so often, not all the time, there's lots of communities who are actively talking about racism and the impacts of racism. But this pattern that we've been in, especially around, for example, police brutality towards Black community here in the US, that there's just this cycle of avoidance and intrusion. It's often like we won't talk about it for a number of years, and then all of a sudden, a trauma is sparked, in this case through the murder of George Floyd, this video, and then there's a deep intrusion into the collective consciousness. And this cycle just often continues. So I just wanted to make that connection between where we often talk about PTSD as individualized, but how we could start to think collectively about this cycle around what I'd say is a trauma around slavery and racism. And then inside of that, the possibility of all the opening happening and the healing that's possible here. I don't know, some of you have seen this. I think it's a quote from Milton Friedman, who's an economist. It's going around that in a moment of adversity or in a moment of opening, the ideas that are on the cutting room floor suddenly become viable. And so all these openings happening and conversations that I never would have thought would be happening, whatever your political affiliation here, but there's a deep opening and conversations possible that weren't probably 2 months ago, based on all this pressure. So I just want to remind us all, for those, as we're offering mindfulness instruction to others, there's both the adversity and where mindfulness is going to be difficult, but then all the potential here right now for people to be in openings, to turn and face their own trauma. So I see it as a moment of just potential opportunity, and one of also where I think we want to tread carefully, which is why I think this community feels so robust of people. I just want to say my experience of this community is a lot of people who care. It's a lot, and not just in a flaky way. I'm not saying like a soft care. It's like a grounded, meaningful care. Like, how can you care well for people that are struggling with trauma, including yourself? So let me just say something then about R.A.I.N. So what I just said there about the potential opportunities, to me, this is the highest expression of mindfulness and trauma, is the ability for an individual or a group to turn towards trauma with mindfulness, with presence. That, to me, is why I'm here, because it's so moving to me to see someone go, I can be with this. And I see a lot of communities now, especially white communities, even saying, I will turn and face places that I have not been looking. And so one of the tools inside of this is R.A.I.N. A lot of, if you've been here before, you know that a lot of the focus of the trauma-sensitive mindfulness work that we're often involved in is, how do you help people when they're dysregulated, and what are the tools that will help them come back into practice? One of the ways it's talked about is working with and being with. When do you actively work with your experience? Maybe you take a walk, maybe you do something different. But then there's also being with, which is the whole part of this path to me, is the power of being with. So R.A.I.N. is one of the ways that I think being with can be so powerful. And The R.A.I.N acronym has been used for a number of years. I first learned it from Michele McDonald. Some of you might have heard from her, but she was one of my first meditation teachers. And Michele, I was sitting with her in the 90s. She's a Buddhist teacher in the Vipassana tradition. And Michele was working with R.A.I.N. And then I'm going to use Tara Brach's, the way that she's been breaking down the acronym. And that is, why don't I put it into the chat box here? Here we go. So the way that Tara with R.A.I.N, I just chatted it there, is recognize, allow, investigate, and nurture. That used to be non-identification, which we could talk more about. And this is a way to awaken mindfulness and compassion. This is a way to actually work with it. And it's an acronym that seems to prove very helpful. I know it does for me. And so I want to talk you through R.A.I.N and how I see it, where it benefits working with trauma and where we can run into some trouble. And then I'll guide us through practice, and then I'll open it up for conversation here. So let me start with recognize. I'll spend just a couple minutes on each here. So many of you will know R.A.I.N, but if it's new to you, so recognize as the first letter in R.A.I.N, that amazing ability to wake up, to have a moment of noticing, recognizing what's happening in the present moment when it's actually happening. An example, yesterday, I've been quarantined now for, a number of months, and there's construction happening just outside my home. And I can go through hours and hours of just feeling deep irritation. There's just a lot of intrusive noise. And then if I just can recognize that, like, oh, I'm irritated because, let's just start. I'm just irritated. There's a recognition and awakening. I can actually just see what's happening. That moment invites a ton of freedom and is really at the basis of so many mindful teachings of waking up over and over, not being caught inside of identification or inside of a pattern of thought. This is massive with trauma because trauma is often pulling people into the past when we're experiencing traumatic symptoms. Now, that's not always the case. Of course, there will be moments where someone is experiencing active live trauma because of conditions in the current moment. And often the people that I'm working with, and from my experience, a lot of you are working with, are having symptoms based on events that are not happening in that exact moment. And it is an intense vortex. For those of you that studied trauma, it is like you get pulled into the movie. Whether it's the images, the sensations, it is a trance. It's often a deep trance. And the possibility of recognizing, oh, I'm having sensations connected to a trauma in the present moment, that recognition is huge for trauma survivors. So I think our recognizing is really helpful for trauma survivors. Then there's also a difficulty, just on a name here, which is that for my research around this, in terms of neuroscience, a lot of our ability to actually be mindful in a moment is situated, of course, in all different parts of the brain, but primarily in the newest parts of our brain, specifically the prefrontal cortex, which some of you know is talked about by Bessel van der Kolk as the watchtower, this ability to actually observe, to be in dual awareness. And the trauma survivor is often experiencing highly activated elements of the brain that are older. So you've probably heard of the amygdala. Sometimes it's called the survival brain, the hippocampus. So when someone's going through a trauma, parts of the brain that are older are firing, and it becomes more difficult for the newer parts of the brain to actually regulate in that moment. So to actually just have a moment of recognizing and waking up in that moment for a trauma survivor, it becomes more difficult when you're actually living through traumatic symptoms. So we can talk more about that if you'd like in the Q&A, but it's just one thing I wanted to presence is when the survival parts of your brain are lighting up, it's actually harder to be mindful for a whole bunch of different reasons. So that's recognized, and that's what I want to do for these letters, just acknowledge where it helps and where it hinders. I'll go a little quicker through these last couple. So second is allow. And allowing gets paired so effectively with recognize. So we recognize, we wake up, there's a presence, and then allowing is a deep letting be. not trying to change the situation. There's some agreement with our internal experience. Now, to be clear and to loop back to what I was saying about racial injustice or any kind of systems, that doesn't necessarily mean agreement with larger social systems, but it's agreement to your experience in that present moment. So my experience of allowing is kind of a softening and allowing, even with difficulty. So yesterday with my irritation around the construction, recognizing it and then being like, all right, okay, let me take a breath. Let me allow my irritation. I'm not going to try to push it away. I'm going to be with it. With trauma, allowing can be both amazing and it's also really difficult. And the metaphor I want to use here is a soda bottle. I grew up in Canada, it's a pop bottle, but here in America, it's soda. One of the ways that trauma is talked about is a soda bottle. That when you've lived through a trauma, you're working with deeply seated survival energy. And often what happens is a freeze or immobility. And one of the ways you could think about this is a soda bottle that's been shaken up. When you're working with someone who's experiencing post-traumatic stress or trauma in any way, often their nervous systems are akin to a soda bottle. It's charged in there because a survival response actually often gets capped by immobility. So there's an unresolved survival response that's often known as fight or flight that is kind of unexpressed in the body. So if I'm just to ask a trauma survivor that I'm working with who's really in active trauma, if I just said, you know those sensations that you're experiencing in your legs, that intense charge, or the emotions that are here, I just invite you to allow them to be here. That's a great idea and it might work for a number of people, but for a number of survivors, that actually might be too much. Yeah, they can't actually allow that level of charge to run through the body, which is actually why trauma is so unique and remains trapped in the body over time. It's like if we could just allow the shaking, the crying, the movement, the survival energy to run through the body, we wouldn't be as traumatized in the first place. So when it comes to allowing, the ways that people often, trauma survivors, will integrate trauma is gradually. So think back to the soda bottle, the difference between cracking the top open and then all the soda flows out and there's an overwhelm, there's a flooding. The difference between that and then gently twisting to allow some of the pressure out. That's an allowing that can happen, but it's done gradually. This is really important for people that are healing from trauma. And I'm just flagging it here with allow to say there may be people who you're working with where they're actually going to need some one-to-one support. If you're a trauma professional and you can work with them, great. But often what people need is some one-to-one guidance of how to actually crack that lid very gently to allow some of the survival energy to run through the body. So allowing is great and it's challenging. It's not easy. Okay, I'm saying more than I thought I was going to, but I'll keep going. And then again, I would love to dig into any questions around this at any point. So let me talk about investigate and then nurture, and then we'll all lead you through practice. So investigate is a moment to bring awareness and curiosity to what's happening in the present moment. And I'll say this is one of the more challenging ones for me because I often think of investigate cognitively. Like I need to think, okay, well, what's happening here? And I get kind of in my head about it. But the way that Tara Brach and others often talk about it is a gentle, curious investigation of our present moment experience, often through sensations. Some of the questions that Tara will recommend are things like, what emotions are here? What most wants my attention? Or how am I experiencing this in the body right now? Investigating can be very helpful for trauma survivors that have dissociated and that actually can't feel sensations. So much of the trauma literature talks about befriending sensations. That's the key aspect of healing from trauma. Feeling the body. So many of you probably seen this bit. So many of the top books on trauma all have the body in it. Like the body keeps the score, the body remembers, the body bears the burden. The body is huge with trauma. Investigating sensations is really important. And inside of this work around trauma-sensitive mindfulness, over-attending to traumatic sensations, over-investigating sensations connected to trauma can leave people dysregulated. We need to be careful here. So if you're working with a trauma survivor who's saying, I'm having so much energy in my abdomen, or I feel just this dread in my gut, I'd caution you all to say, great, go into that, investigate it. Great, you recognized it, just allow it and investigate. Again, for some people that might be deeply healing. For others, that can be actually dysregulating and re-traumatizing. So I'd be cautious around investigate. If we go too much into the investigation of sensations, for example, we can trick our brain into thinking the trauma is happening again. Have you ever had the experience where it's like you're paying myopic attention to a sensation and you convince yourself like, wow, I'm back in that intense experience that's at the root of the sensation? So I just wanted to flag that around investigation, to be cautious about how myopically we ask people to focus on sensations. And then the last is nurture, which is so key, so key. This ability to direct some care, kindness, and compassion towards ourselves, or to guide people to direct care and compassion towards themselves in a moment of adversity and struggle. I think this is huge right now. This is massive. Not as a way to let people off around accountability or places that they need to do work, but just having some sense of kindness and gentleness with our attention in the moment. So yesterday, for example, this construction example, I noticed I had the recognition, I'm anxious, I'm stressed. I allow it to be there, I investigate it. And then the nurturing was like, yeah, you've been inside for 3 months. I'm watching a lot of people go through a lot of pain and struggle. There's this huge shift online. Like, it just softened me. And I think we all need this to some level. And then let me say one thing about trauma really quickly is that when we ask survivors to bring nurturance and care and love to the places that they were wounded, what can also happen is a flood of the number of the care that was not there. That when we ask someone to bring care to their wounds, that can actually also be challenging. And just to be prepared when it comes to trauma, getting back to that soda bottle, is that things become pretty spring-loaded around trauma. So that nurturance is huge and important. And also just to know that when people bring that love and care towards themselves, the flood of times that that care wasn't there, especially during a trauma, can actually come to the surface. So we need to be prepared when we're asking people to both do nurturance, but also R.A.I.N, that it can be deeply evocative. And that's really what I wanted to say with R.A.I.N. It's both so helpful, it's so popular now around eliciting, cultivating mindfulness and compassion. And there are some tripwires that I think we need to be aware of. So that's what I wanted to say about R.A.I.N. Thank you for coming with me through that. And then I would love to do a brief R.A.I.N. practice, kind of like a light R.A.I.N., just to remind us all of the rhythm of the R.A.I.N. So I'm gonna invite us to be in a practice for the next about 4 minutes, and then we'll open it up here. If a practice right now feels like it won't be supportive, you come back in 4 or 5 minutes, or you can do whatever practice will support you. Otherwise, I invite you to just find a posture that will support you to be both alert and also somewhat relaxed. And just taking some moments here to settle yourself. You can decide if you'd like to have your eyes open or closed during this practice. If you like, you can just take a moment to also notice your current environment that you're in, whether through sound, maybe through sight, just orienting to the current time and space. Where, as I said, trauma can bring us into the past, we can use our senses to help us ground in the present moment. And as we begin here, just noticing what is the quality of presence that's here right now. And I invite you to scan your life, your experience right now, and noticing if there's any part of your world where you're feeling any particular quality of challenge. Could be maybe some agitation, some upset. And inside of this, invite you to choose something on a scale that you can stay present for. Maybe on a scale of 1 to 10 in terms of intensity, that's on the lower end. But you're in choice here about if you're working with a challenge, what you'd like to work with. And you might explore labeling whatever that challenge or experience is. Yeah, maybe it's fear, some anger, frustration, anxiety, or agitation. Or it could also just be noticing your experience as it is right now, not needing to work with any particular challenge. Just taking a moment to recognize what is here in your present moment experience. And then perhaps with a deeper inhale and exhale, seeing if you can just allow that experience to be here right now, whatever that is. Having recognized, maybe even labeled what's here, just seeing if there's some room for allowing that experience to be here without trying to shift or change it. That there's some basic agreement with this experience right now. If this connects to something unjust in the world, that doesn't mean you're agreeing with the injustice, but there's some agreement of whatever is here for you, not needing to fight it right now. And then ideally with some interest and curiosity and maybe some gentleness, invite you to investigate where you feel this experience the strongest. Could be in the body. You might even here place a hand wherever you feel this experience. It could be where you feel some vulnerability. But just taking a moment to bring some curiosity to this experience, some investigation. And not in a cognitive sense, but more a felt and embodied curiosity. Could be what emotions are here or sensations. If you've made some contact with the body, just feeling that presence and that curiosity of your own touch. Just touching the vulnerability here. And then an invitation is to ask this place, what does it most need right now? How does it want me to be with it? And inside of this, extending some care to that experience, maybe that vulnerability. And perhaps it could be some words that feel healing for you, or some assurance, some care. And just being in the experiment here with nurturance, what is going to best support? And if nurturing doesn't feel available or feels hard to connect with, then also just making room for that. You can have care for that experience as well. And then in these final moments, just letting go of any doing. Just noticing the quality of presence that's here right now. And just seeing if you can rest back into that. And finally, if there are any people or groups of people that you would like to extend any of this care or nurturance towards, I invite you to do that as well. Could be people that are close in, could be an animal friend, a four-legged, or also people wider out in the circles of concern, communities. Just taking a moment if you'd like to direct that elsewhere to others as a way to complete this practice. Okay. Thanks, everyone. So I'm going to open it up here to the community. And just an invitation, if you haven't spoken before, especially want to invite you to share. Some people have been here before and gotten to speak. And I'm going to experiment here with hand raising, which, if I believe I have this right, if you click on the participant tab, I believe there should be the option in the bottom somewhere in there. Oh, there you go. Some of you found it. So I'm just going to go with hand raising because other times we just unmute. But again, if you have any comments, questions, thoughts, things that you'd like to share here on the other side of that practice, anything that I've talked about, or could be trauma-sensitive mindfulness more generally, I invite that. So I have the Pioneer Valley Shambhala Center is first here. If you're here, can you unmute yourself?
Hi, yes, hi. My name is Mariah.
Hey, Mariah. Hey.
Morning, I hosted a meditation and I didn't realize I was still under that name.
No problem. Hey, where's the Pioneer Valley Shambhala Center?
It's in Northampton, Massachusetts, Western
cool.
Massachusetts. So I wanted to just ask you if you could please give us a few pointers on how you would work with an individual on gradual approach, especially when you were talking about investigation.
Yeah. So how to slow it down, or how to do the gradual thing, like the pop the soda bottle.
Yeah.
That's it, right? That's the big part of this work. So I'll give a couple thoughts, and then are you working? You're working with meditators?
Yes, I mostly groups.
Yeah. And one other question, are you thinking specifically around the investigation aspect of R.A.I.N, or are we talking more generally here?
The investigation.
Yeah, that's great. So one of the, why I wanted to talk about, I think investigate actually is one of the trickiest spots of R.A.I.N when it comes to trauma. And I mentioned this, but I talked about, this problem of over-attending to traumatic stimuli. And one of the ways, for those of you that maybe are newer to trauma work, One of the ways that trauma is often talked about is like a vortex, that if you get close enough to the internal experiences of trauma, your attention will naturally be pulled into this whirlpool. So Peter Levine, some of you've heard of from somatic experiencing, often talks about these whirlpools. And this is why I actually got into this topic around trauma-sensitive mindfulness, is that what does it mean to be asking anyone to be paying attention and investigating their experience when it's so easy for them to get caught in a whirlpool and to get pulled in? And what a lot of trauma practitioners talk about is, in order to safely work with trauma, you have to be able to maneuver around those whirlpools, basically not just get pulled in. Because if you overattend, then you just kind of circle the drain and you get flooded and it's overwhelming. So I think thanks for the question. It's such a great question. And this is really it's the heart of the work. It's like, how do we, so a couple thoughts. One would be, at the most general level, do you, and as a mindfulness teacher, any of you offering mindfulness, are you aware of the potential pitfalls of investigation of sensations, for example? Like, are you aware? The fact that you're here on the call is 50% of the whole process to me, that there's some awareness of all of you that investigation doesn't always just elicit ease and etc. So just your awareness, your knowledge. But then the key, tell me your name again. I'm sorry.
Oh, Mariah.
Mariah, thanks, Mariah. The one of the ways that I love is talked about is from someone named Babette Rothschild, and she talks about hitting the brakes. And she says, do this trauma survivors that you're working with have tools to modulate the intensity of their investigation, their practice? She tells the story that when she was a teenager, she was the first person that got her license in her small town. So all her friends would go to the parking lot with her. And she said the first thing that she always made sure they could do is know where the brake was, to hit the brake, like first thing. And so similarly with trauma survivors, do people know where the brake is? And if they start to get pulled in, do they know ways of actually modulating the intensity of R.A.I.N, of their investigation? So a couple examples are things as simple as opening the eyes. Or it could be, I know someone who touching the ground is really helpful for them. Having an object, I have a thread here, having an object that they know that they can direct their attention towards, instead of actually the overwhelming and traumatic sensations or thoughts. Being able to shift posture, taking a break. But even more fundamentally, does the person know that if the investigation starts to feel overwhelming, that backing away may actually be the most nurturing move? Does that make sense? Like that do they know? Because I know for me, when I was in practice, I was like, well, I'm cowardice if I back away from this.
Right.
Let me, so it's both the consciousness, but then also really, do they have the tools of hitting the brakes? And that's a big part of for those of you that have been in the trauma sensitive work, it's a lot of what this community is up to, is practically, like, what can they do? So those are a couple thoughts. What would you add, or how does that land?
Well, I was just thinking that it's definitely, clear that it needs to be something that you teach up front, like
Yeah.
right from the beginning. Yeah. These, options, or these different ways to hit the brake. And then eventually, as you do things like R.A.I.N with a group or an individual, that's already there. You don't have to kind of, come in as an emergency and be like, oh, why don't we try this?
Yeah, exactly. That built-in kind of pre-work is such a key, I think, for trauma sensitive practice. But then I'll say to you, but the whole group here is, how do we do that without scaring people? And that art of saying, to not say, hey, this is a really scary, traumatic time, you might get flooded, or something like that. Like, I know sometimes I can be too blunt. So what are the ways to actually, and you'll all find your ways here, but how do you offer a couple of options? But really, it's like, Mariah, do they know that they could come to you and say, hey, I was investigating and that was really hard. Can I talk to you about it? Because shame's a big one. People often feel like they're failing if they can't stick with it. So I think however you can build in the options for sure, but also trusting in the power of awareness. So just, I want to say one thing about this Tara Brach, because it's R.A.I.N that I'm talking about, and she's so been someone who's popularized this. She reminds us around trauma that if we go too far into options, it's distrusting the power of presence and awareness. Like R.A.I.N works. And so I know if we go too far, like, okay, go for a walk or don't, that it's okay to also be uncomfortable and get triggered. So anyway, just such a balance inside of it. Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah. Thanks for chiming in. Appreciate it. Okay. Thanks, Mariah. So the next person I have here is Ruth. Ruth,
Oh,
are you here? And if you are, do you mind unmuting yourself?
I am unmuted, and I hope this isn't off topic, but that's a very powerful meditation. I'm in Arkansas, and there was recently an article in the New Yorker about the horrible conditions in a prison here in Arkansas during COVID. It's subhuman. And I would like to ask people to, with that well of compassion, send it to those people that are living in that moment right now, and that have, it's been a horrible situation this prison has for at least 80 years.
Yeah.
And so
Thanks,
it may be off topic, but
no, that's
anyone that can send energy.
actually, Ruth, I'd say even there's huge organizing efforts happening right now in terms of prisons. And I'd encourage folks, if you're someone who's doing organizing work around getting support inside of prisons, that to please put it into the chat box. I can't do it right now, but then I've known a couple campaigns of ways to actually ease the burden inside of jails and prisons. People like sending hand sanitizer and soap. There's different campaigns to support. So I would say, Ruth, thank you for saying that, and also encourage people to really move resources there inside of it. Thank you for, that's been, I'll say one thing too, Ruth. I feel like, isn't it so intense inside of COVID, the more that we turn our attention to which communities are being most impacted around COVID and the vulnerabilities that, especially inside of prisons, people are facing. So thank you for raising consciousness around it. Yeah. The next person I have here is Erica. Erica, are you here?
I am.
Hi.
Hi. Hi.
Welcome.
From Vancouver.
Oh, Vancouver. Hey, that's that's where my home. I lived there for 10 years. I miss it. I miss it so much. Is it raining? Is it not raining?
It was, but now it's cleared right up. It is. The Salish Sea is gorgeous.
Oh, right on.
So I am, I would say, an emerging practitioner in terms of trauma-informed work, trauma-informed mindfulness teaching work. I work mostly with youth in concurrent disorders and in a very structured, in a hospital.
Great.
But my love is like the body work, and I come from a big focusing background.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm really curious about linking, the felt sense in the focusing work and how I'm hearing so much similarity in there. But the particular of this question is around working with youth and the yeah.
Anyone got anything on that? Yeah.
You know? So the spike is so quick, and the withdrawal from like, nope, I'm not here anymore, like all of that. And so I'm just curious of your comments on that, or any, any tips and tricks. I'm hoping to do MBCT training in September, and then more in offering this into the community with the trauma-informed huge layer, because that's more important than the science piece.
Yeah. Quick question is, when you're working with teens mostly, it sounds like, and when you said you're in a highly structured hospital setting, what's the level of mandatedness?
It's a mix. They get referred all the time. Whether they want to show up or not is up to them, and there's no consequence. So that's okay. And I can take it out into the community. So we often go to the beach. We often go for walks in the woods. There's lots of flexibility in that way.
Yep, that's awesome. And you were saying with sensations, like you're someone who has a love of the focusing and internal work, and then how to really work it with teens who might be kind of popping out of it really quickly. Is that right?
Yeah, the body work, I mean, it translates well when you talk to adults who are just like me, who want to show up and be like, "Ooh, yeah, let's talk about the body."
Yeah, right, right,
Teenagers are
right.
like, "Let's not, though. It's awkward." Yeah,
No,
so it's
totally.
kind of a practice question and kind of an internal process question.
That's great. For those that don't know, the focusing work is it Genlin?
Yeah,
Eugene Genlin? Yeah, this is which involves a lot of mindfulness based, to me, internal work, really going towards sensations, which is so important when it comes to trauma. So just for folks that if they don't know that work, a couple thoughts. One is, if anyone does anyone have youth figured out? Please just chat it into the box. I noticed for me that uh, we it's different. It's challenging, and I have been trying my best the last couple of years to really keep connecting with youth. So I just invite folks to be putting resources into the chat box here, Erica, for what you're saying, but I'll say a couple things. One is I want to lift up the work of someone named Sam Himmelstein. Have you heard of him?
he wrote a book, a trauma
He did.
I just ordered it.
Okay, cool. So him
Yeah.
and I did a podcast with him maybe a year ago, and he's someone who you might like that conversation, but Rhonda McGee also does some cool work around youth. But basically, when I've talked to people around youth, they've said that the most trauma-informed practices around choice is how do you really, given ageism, that tendency to go power over, how do you deeply, deeply empower youth? And Sam has all these great examples. I mean, I want to be conscious of Sam being also another white man in this space right now who's offering. But so I want to invite, please, if folks know I'm seeing other resources in the chat. Please lift folks up so I can keep learning more. But Sam's great in terms of actual case studies of, like, he's walking with someone, he's inviting that kind of interoception, that body-based awareness, and how to do that in a way that's really, really empowering for youth. And from the sounds of it, it's really about two things. Like, one, your embodiment. Are you embodying, like, hey, you're in choice here. I'm not trying to have an agenda with you. So your practice over time. And then he talks about also acknowledging the structures in place that disempower youth, not as a way to create victims, but actually to say, like, I just want to acknowledge that you're in choice here. The ways that he kind of actually breaks down that hierarchy, he's really great at that. So those are a couple thoughts. But then he also talks about the fact that there's a developmental piece too, that there's still a developing brain inside of adolescence. So that kind of continuous interoceptive awareness, especially if trauma there, is actually really hard. So go slow to go fast, like really, really sips, like little bits at a time. And then helping them build relevance for themselves about why that actually might be useful for them is really important too. But in my experience, the people that I look up to the most here, they've just said it came with time, that they got really artsy about being able to, like, offer something as an invitation and empower the youth along the way. So those are a couple thoughts. And it's not also my wheelhouse inside of that. And Sam's someone that is just, that's where he's focused his attention. So
Thank you. Yeah.
yeah,
Can I just make one more comment?
please.
Here?
Yeah. What do you thoughts? Yeah, what do you got?
Yeah, so I just, I'm finishing my grad work right now, and I just got this beautiful book called Decolonizing Breath, and it's a collection of mostly Canadian, many folks of color, Indigenous writers that are working really deeply in this space of how does mindfulness, yoga, all of these sort of things that have been detached from often very culturally based ritual practices and ceremony practices into a place of, like, how does this work across the board, and how do we how do I, as like white Western practitioner with tons of privilege, show up in a space where I'm trying to get folks to come into that place in a good way, and it's just really, it's rich. I'll put that book in the chat too. But
yeah, would you mind putting it into the chat? That'd be awesome. Thanks for saying that. I think you're opening a massive box. Yeah, because just say one more thing on that. The respiratory system is, as Well, the respiratory system is directly connected to the sympathetic nervous system. So just to know, when we're asking people to attend to the breath, for some people that might be relaxing. For others, that's actually taking them right into that vortex. And that's not to say don't work always with the breath, but that just so that we keep expanding our awareness, that the breath isn't always neutral, and that sometimes it can actually really evoke a sympathetic response in trauma. So I love that. I'm excited to read that book around the ways that can actually lead towards decolonization.
And it's a free download. You can
Oh,
buy
it
the
is?
book and support the actual authors, and it's a free download PDF. So
Hey, right on.
it's a beautiful offering to the collection.
Right on.
Thank you
Thanks,
so much.
Erica. That's awesome. Yeah, please put it into the chat. There's a lot of hands here that I would love to, and we probably only have time for really like a comment. I see Erica. I see I'm sorry, my pronunciation. My Nyok, Todd, and Amy. If any of you have just more like a comment, are you willing to just jump in here? Because we probably can't go too deep into it. Or we could just sit in silence and hang out together. Erica, Tushar, if you're here.
I can just say a comment. I work with youth, so
Hey, tell us.
My organization, Inner Strength Education, we've worked with 10,000 high school students in Philadelphia over the last few years.
Right on.
And I was going to ask a question, but because now we're all online and they all keep their videos off, so sometimes my online classes with them are 250 students with no video. And I'm very sensitive around breath right now because I can't breathe is associated with so much violence, right now. And for the 15, 16, 17-year-olds, it's very hard for them to make sense of all of it. And so I was curious, and maybe people can chat later, is figuring out how to continue to lean in and create community online when I can't see how, because most of the work is so relational. And when we can't, I can't physically see them, to be able to see how this is landing, that I'm doing much more compassion-based, much more grounding exercises, investigation and all of that. I've taken a much lighter touch and a step back just because I feel reassurance and support and community is probably the biggest thing needed right now.
That's awesome. Thanks I really appreciate you raising up the piece around breath right now, also in terms of I can't breathe and how charged. And then the challenge of the online piece right now and how to monitor. One of the trauma sensitive, I feel like a tool would be often knowing like how are people doing, and often we're noticing how people are at the end, but it's harder online, especially if you're not using video, it sounds like.
The students won't. So when they're in class, they're not required to turn on their videos, and so they don't.
Yep.
And then they don't know, they won't say much in chat because they don't know how they're being perceived by their peers either.
Yep.
Difficult.
Boy, such a moment. The last meetup that we had, we actually took the hour on online best practices and the challenges. And I'm with you in it. I'll just be committed to just keep, by email or otherwise, keep sharing best practices, because I'm trying to work with folks to know in that exact example, how can you monitor effectively? Like, can you do a little at the end, one word checkout, things like that? But it's so hard, and every context is different. So thanks for your work. And let's keep talking about the online piece. I think that's so key. What was the name of the organization again?
It's called Inner Strength Education. We just switched the name. It was Inner Strength Foundation. So if you Google us, it's probably under that. And we're in Philadelphia.
In Philly. Okay.
Yeah.
That's awesome. Thanks for your work.
Sure.
Hey, David.
Yes.
I think you called my name, but you pronounced it wrong. I'm Tisha.
Hi, Tisha. I'm so glad you corrected me. Thank you.
That's okay. I wanted to just jump in. This has been so rich. I'm in Charleston, South Carolina.
Mm-hmm.
And I want to go back to the point you brought up about PTSD. We hear that a lot. And as an African-American woman, I've been reading a lot of the work of Resma Menakem on racialized trauma. His stuff is so damn deep and so good, and for all of us. But he changes the P to persistent. And if you're a person in a Black body in the United States of America, that trauma is never post. That stress is never post. And it's persistent. So can you talk a little bit about the practices that we can, delve into the word persistent, changing that P instead of post to persistent? I know living here in Charleston, it's the anniversary of the Emmanuel 9, where the shooter came into the church and killed the 9 people at the prayer meeting. So that trauma is never post. It's always persistent. So how do you handle, healing communities of color that have dealt with the trauma from 1619 to now, and still it's never a post-traumatic thing. It's always persistent.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thanks, Tisha. Hey, Tisha, will you hang out for a sec? So I'm aware we're at time. I had a request, Tisha, if you could, or if someone else, you might have done this with Risma, if you could put, Risa's putting out so many amazing resources right now.
Yes.
Could you, if other people could chat into the box, I think, or into the chat, that would be awesome. And I'm going to go a couple minutes over here just because that's such an important piece. And I realize for some of you, you might need to also leave right now. So if you need to take off because we're at the top of the hour, thanks for being here. And let me just spend a couple of minutes because that's such an important question. So you said persistent, is that right?
Yes.
I hadn't actually heard that. I think that's just spot on. I think and I think it's super problematic if it's ever talked about in a post way.
Right.
And so I just
like
think
it's like post, like it's over, and it's never over, because, and we see it, these things, they keep happening. Even with George Floyd, there's the hangings in California of the 2 brothers that were hanging from the tree. That wasn't a suicide, I don't think, but they're still investigating. But it's never post. It's never post.
Tisha, I have a question for you about this, about the post thing. This comes from I 100%, like, to me, that's the embodiment of a trauma sensitive frame.
Right.
Is that that can be so harmful if someone's talking about racism as a teacher, for example, and is talking in the past tense. So when you say that, I'm like, you're right. That's yes. Like, that feels so key. And I have a question about practitioners I've worked with in multiracial spaces where there has been something also empowering for a trauma survivor to say there's an element of post in aspects of my experience around race and racism. Like they actually get to claim and say, I've been reliving this trauma. And I want to also name that even though I'm experiencing it over and over in the present moment in my body, I also want to name that there's that person who harmed me is not here in the moment. They're not, maybe they're not alive. So there's an element of post. And so my question for you is, I think about it like we need to make room for both, that there can be times where there's a post, but it has to be inside of what you're saying around persistent. And I find that challenging, but does that hold water for you about the possibility of both?
The possibility of both is always there, because living where I live in Charleston, the history is the post part is the historical piece, because African Americans, when we were brought to this country, we were brought to Charleston and Jamestown, Virginia. Those are the 2 entry points. So when I go downtown Charleston and I see all the remnants of the post, the historical part is the post, but those ideas and some of the ways of thinking are still present. They're still with us. And I'm like, okay, how do you balance the 2? But I think what you really have to do is continually do the work, because it's present and it's post and it stays in the body. So we're always having to dispel or get rid of, that energy, that trauma that's always there. So it's persistent and it's post. I see that, but it's really persistent. I think it's persistent now a lot because we're home, we're seeing the news, we're listening, we're hearing things and seeing all these, everything's happening so fast. So that's where the persistent part
Yeah.
comes in. And that's where the re-traumatizing part comes in as well. But I do get that, what you're saying, the
Yeah.
balance. Yeah.
I'm so glad. I had not heard that with Risma about the persistent. I think that's just so important.
Yeah, I watched a YouTube with him. I'm just like enthralled with his work and just discovered it. And the book's been out since 2017. And some people put some comments in the chat. He is offering a 5-day free course on his website as well. Just go to
Awesome. Great.
Risma.com. It's a 5-day course, and it's very, very informative. But he brought up the word persistent yesterday. He was talking to a guy, and I was like, I never thought about it that way too.
And you're bringing us full circle here. Maybe this would be an okay place to close, because any doubt that there has been any doubt that there wasn't PTSD around slavery and around racial injustice here in the US should be quashed right now because of what's happening. I mean, it's like the persistent, it's here right now. And people are crying out and saying, this never went away. And so I appreciate you bringing it in. I actually just want to say one more thing about this
David.
moment in BL. Yeah, I so appreciate you. My read of trauma is that, folks know Judith Herman wrote a book called Trauma and Recovery, which really takes a politicized look at the history of trauma and talks about that our definitions of trauma are tied to social movements, and that it's social movements like the feminist movement that actually allowed us to start to legitimize sexual assault towards women. And so I think we're in a moment where there's been enough powerful Black organizing here in the US for centuries, but especially with Black Lives Matter this last 6-7 years now, that it's a moment where I think there's a collective readiness to start to actually turn and face collective trauma around racism. And so I feel moved and ready, I think, for this moment. And just that you're bringing this in, I think, is so spot on. And I want to keep talking about it. Anything else you want to say, Tisha, before we shift off this?
No, I just appreciate you so much. And I'm new to trauma as well, the trauma work. I'm a high school teacher here in North Charleston, South Carolina. And another thing, North Charleston, South Carolina was where Walter Scott got shot in the back 8 times. So the shooting in Atlanta is linked to that, so it's always persistent.
Yeah.
So that's always with us. But I appreciate you. And I started teaching meditation too in my community. So I teach online, and just, Spirit is just bringing so many things to me. I'm in graduate school too for trauma and resilience. I'm getting an MED in that right now and loving all the work. And I'm doing a research project around trauma in the body. So I'm going to, reference your work and Riesma's work and Vander Kolk's, all that.
Great.
And learning about how trauma impacts our physical body, our emotional body as well, but the physical and how it impacts us. And we're seeing that too, I think, with COVID and how it's hitting communities of color.
Absolutely.
That's just a manifestation of the trauma that's held in bodies of color in this country, and the healthcare system and all of that. It's all linked. It's all linked to the persistent trauma. So now is a dynamic time for all of us, and the teachings are out there and people are not being afraid anymore. So I am so grateful. And I led a practice this weekend on self-compassion with my community meditation group, and it's a free class. So it's with Still So Studios in Charleston. But this weekend, this Sunday, I'm going to try R.A.I.N. I'm going to try that and
let us
leading
know how.
that. Yes, I'll let you know how it goes.
Yeah. Thanks.
Thank you.
Tisha. Thank you for your work and jumping in there at the end.
All right. Appreciate everyone.
Thanks, Tisha. So glad. Thanks for going over for those that stayed. Appreciate the number of people that stayed here. And let's shift here. I'm just going to 30-second practice here. So wherever you are, just Taking a breath or two and just noticing what's here, that recognition, that awakeness. And then allowing whatever's here to be there. Maybe some gentle curiosity. And then some nurturance to yourself, to others here on the call in this community. And then also extending out to others as well. Okay, everyone. I'm super moved by this group. Thank you so much. In a moment, we're going to be in breakout rooms. And so if you'd like to stick around, please do. Just a quick announcement. If you want to know about my work, like if you're new to it, you want to keep going into it, we had an introductory course around basically these different pieces of hitting the brakes, things that we talked about today. And I think by the fall, we'll have something up online. Because it's all moving online. So please stay tuned. We want to just empower the community here. And please keep putting resources in. I really appreciate the resource sharing here. And in a moment, I'm just going to invite us all to unmute and we can say goodbye to each other. And then if you want to stick around, I'll give you some instructions for the breakout rooms. But again, thank you. And we can unmute yourselves and have a great day.
David,
Thank you so much.
thank you. Everybody.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Have a good one. Great, David. Thank you.
So, this is the best part.
Thank you.
Wonderful
so
first
much.
experience, and thank you, Ingrid, for introducing me to this.
Ciao, ciao.
Thank you so much.
I put my email in the chat for anyone who wants to email me.
Oh, thanks, Tisha. That's great.
Okay. Thank you.
Thanks all. So many faces. I want to meet everyone here. Just be like, tell me about it.